Pac-Man had a rough transition into 3D. Well, that's only half true, I think. Pac-Man himself is kind of the problem. He's a circle. Making him more complicated makes him look goofy. The Pac-Man World games that ushered in the 3D era, though, are pretty alright, if not the most impressive games ever made. Pac-Man World Re-Pac is a remake of the first Pac-Man Worlds. Re-Pac makes it sound kinda cheap, since I'm thinking about it. While much of the game remains the same, the remake definitely works hard to add quality of life changes, an easy mode, a lessened requirement on collectibles, a new move, some toned down bits. The game has been cleaned up pretty nicely, as far as I can tell, although it's been many years since I last played the first game at my cousin's house. Re-Pac is still fairly new, coming out about a year ago in 2022, kinda out of nowhere, as a sort of middleware release, a bit of a short little budget title, and it popped out across the whole suite of the current stuff, PS4 and 5, Xbox One and Series X, Switch, and PC. Pac-Man World Re-Pac is a pretty typical PlayStation 1 era platformer, with a lot of similarities to Crash Bandicoot in ways. Linear platforming levels that allow some movement along the axis, giving the stages a bit of vertical depth, although Pac-Man mostly moves horizontally, moving into the background or foreground to avoid obstacles. Pac-Man is given a surprisingly fleshed out moveset and one that's genuinely fun to play around with. Pac-Man's primary move is his ground pound, which on paper is a fairly basic way to defeat enemies, but also gives Pac-Man a bit of extra height on the bounce back up, especially if using it off of an enemy's head, which does start to become a necessity later in the game, but especially early on is a really fun way to break levels, skip platforming segments, or even bypass sections entirely. It was an idea so fun that even Sonic went on to steal it from Pac-Man. My one tiny complaint, and this is admittedly a bit of a nitpick, is that it's also on the jump button. Usually this is pretty convenient, but I do very occasionally spike myself into pits or mistime a jump off a ledge and just dive bomb. Although Pac-Man's ledge grab, itself a great addition to the roster to keep the game's pace up, will often save you when you do make this mistake. The rev roll, on the other hand, feels borrowed from Sonic. Pac-Man can charge himself in place to launch himself in a spinning roll that can also be used to beat enemies, but has some really fun uses outside of that. Ramps appear here and there and can launch Pac-Man over gaps thanks to the crazy speed he gets, but it also has a niche use for its speed otherwise, as some small amount of momentum can be carried into jumps out of it, although not as much as you'd hope, which can then be chained into a ground pound, although Pac-Man is Super Smash Bros. Brawl tier slow and floaty, so it's extremely rare that it comes up. New to the remake specifically is the flutter kick. Pac-Man can do a goofy little flail in midair to extend his horizontal distance very slightly, or to offset the timing on certain moving platforms or other timed obstacles. And this of course is the strongest when paired up with the ground pound bounce. I kinda like the balance in the move as well. It's a really strong move, it helps with jump correction a lot, but it's also kind of a pace killer, so I tried to avoid using it when possible so I didn't slow myself down too much, except for when it was necessary or I messed up too bad, if that makes sense. Lastly, Pac-Man can throw pellets at enemies. The arc is incredibly wimpy, and charging them up spends 5 to give them a bit of a blast radius, which does make it a little bit better, but it's never that interesting to use even when it does occasionally come up, if only because unlike everything else, it completely dead stops you, never feeding into the otherwise fast-paced platforming the game is built on. Like imagine if Mario had to stand around like a dork to use his fireball and it went 2 inches in front of him. It's kinda just unsatisfying and silly. The game rarely strays from the core running and jumping. Swimming comes up here and there and isn't particularly interesting. Pac-Man sinks, jump makes you swim up. It's not terrible at all, it's got a nice pace to it and is used fairly sparingly so it doesn't get old. There are 2 power-ups found throughout the game as well. The metal pellet makes Pac-Man metal. It's just a visually weird invincibility, it nerfs your jump height a little bit, and can be used to sink to the bottom of water, and break chests underwater which you normally can't do, which is occasionally used for cool little challenges where there's a race against the timer on the power-up, but I think it's used in like maybe 5 levels. The power pellet is also an invincibility power effectively, making Pac-Man huge and letting him insta-kill enemies, including the normally invincible ghosts. It's a satisfying little bit, but it's not all that interesting to do. Levels aren't entirely straightforward. In another Crash comparison, they feature lots of little odds and ends to find, not so much in the sense that it's full of alternate paths like Crash is, but in that it asks you to do harder challenges for collectibles. Each level is filled with fruit, and the doors along the route can be opened by having that fruit, which may give you some bonus health, a different fruit, metal pellets, power pellets, or even a bonus stage I'll talk about shortly. Almost all of these require backtracking to the door, which is a bit of a mixed bag. The game loves to do this platforming section 3 times to mix results. It can often be tedious and annoying, especially for slower platforming bits that involve moving platforms, and it's strangely uncommon for the game to offer shortcuts back, although it does occasionally. Despite that, there are times where the trip back is fun on its own, where going back somehow offers a twist on the initial trip through, the change timing of certain obstacles or some kind of secondary route, which does make these a little more tolerable, although there's a lot of them that are kind of just tedious. Speaking on collectibles, keys. There's one per world and it can be used, usually in a different level of the same world, to free Pac-Man's kidnapped family, which gets you the true ending eventually if you save them all. The bonus stage is a fun return to Pac form. It's a Pac-Man maze that takes on elements of the world it takes place in. It controls like classic Pac-Man and has the same mechanics with the power pellets and ghosts, but with some fun gimmicks, like the version in the factory having valves to periodically open or close to slightly reshape the maze, or the final world having spinning totems that breathe fire, forcing a good bit of pre-planning on routes. I love classic Pac-Man, I made a video about it, so these are right up my alley as fun little twists on the classic formula. Speaking of classic Pac-Man, the original arcade game is available as an unlockable here, after beating the game. It's also available on 8 million collections on the same platforms as this game, so getting it isn't that mind-blowing of a reward, but it's a cute little bonus to see an unlockable, older game just thrown in here. For the most part, Re-Pac nails what a platform needs to have. The movement is good, you got fun options, they all chain into each other in fun ways, and it has solid levels. Although I will say the game is quite short. Kinda short and sweet, but also not overly challenging usually. Re-Pac is a cute game. It's not going to win any awards, but Pac-Man himself has made a strange and interesting leap into polygons. He looks fucking goofy, and they play into it. He has this shit-eating grin about him. He flails about like an idiot when you extend your jumps, and he bounces. He's cute in his odd little way. I do have a lot of questions about everyone else. Miss Pac-Man is dead, killed by bizarre legal hang-ups, and in her place is the shockingly unsettling Pac-Mom, who has weirdly feminine legs like the green M&M, and also the Pac Dog is cute, but raises a lot of questions. Also, Pookie from Dig Dug is here. Pac-Land itself has some nice themes too. You'd kinda expect the usual grass, ice, volcano, desert thing, but surprisingly it plays with some pretty novel ones, the Pirate Land especially, which puts a fun twist on the typical beach theme you may see in other games, by making it largely take place along docks, wooden shanties, and boats. The ruins have a dark and mysterious vibe to them, a little cramped and darker, and the factory mixes the usual stuff with underwater piping and furnaces, plus plenty more, and the PS5 displays it in a fantastic 60 FPS 4K. My only real issue is that the theming doesn't change that much visually within worlds. Every level in the pirate area takes place at the same time, uses the same or very similar buildings, and maybe has one unique asset per level. I know the PS1 original was the same way, but that game was dealing with way more limited technology and storage solutions. Not to backseat dev too hard, but I'm imagining like the second level of the pirate world being sundown, while the last is along a starry coast or something. Some areas would be harder than others of course, but it could go a long way. I'd also like to clarify, despite what I just said, that theming switches up enough that it's barely an issue. Each world is 3 levels and a boss, and the novelty of the zone won't wear off too badly in the short span of time you'll spend at each. The music is fun, it does a lot of stuff with the main theme as a leitmotif, kind of recurring it throughout the lens of the world's design, whether that's a sort of synthy electronic version for the future areas or bouncier versions of the carnival. And each stage has its own music even within a world, which each offer their own twists on the sound. The game also likes to intermix little jingles from the arcade game and even sound effects, which really works for Pac-Man aesthetically because it's just so tied to that original game. It's kind of hard to separate Pac-Man from the original game and the mazes and stuff like that. You can't just make a Pac-Man game where he shoots a gun. The game also has a vocal theme for the credits. It's ridiculous, yes, but it's like super cute and goofy in the same way that Pac-Man is in general. It's adorable. It's really cute. While levels in this game are really strong, it's rare to see one with an outstanding idea, so I'll kinda be quick going through this. The game begins with Pac-Man's birthday. The ghosts get a little salty that Pac-Man has single-handedly forced them into a life of second-hand citizenship, and they kidnap his family and friends. It's clean, it's simple, it works. The pirate area doesn't go crazy on gimmicks. As the first area, it does its best to keep things relatively simple as you adjust. The setting does play into one. The levels here have very few true pits, instead having them filled with water, which leads to this world having the most swimming sections by a pretty significant margin, while also mixing in a smaller gimmick with cannons which shoot into the background and announce their presence with scarecrows that pop up just before they shoot. The bosses in this game are surprisingly good. The first boss, the HMS Windbag, a flying pirate ship with giant cartoon eyes, which is not exactly what I would have guessed that they'd go with. It shoots cannonballs towards Pac-Man, who needs to ground pound switches to reflect them back. It's a pretty creative use of one of the primary ways Pac-Man interacts with the world, and with the world's main gimmick. It's a really strong start to the game, actually. The runes area is probably the most forgettable, even though it has some fun gimmicks of its own, like minecarts that travel back and forth as obstacles and falling rock traps. I think it's probably the fact that it's just kind of short, or maybe it just doesn't stand out compared to the wackier areas. Anubis Rex, the boss of the runes, was pretty infamous in the original game for being difficult, to say the least. Although here he's way more reasonable, thanks to some kinder platform placement and a slower pace. The stage starts with a Crash Bandicoot-esque chase sequence. It's a bit of a mess, it's very difficult to tell where things are. It's displayed from a second-person perspective, which is really creative, where you're seeing through the mummy's eyes as it chases you, but it also makes it kind of hard to avoid the subtle traps that kind of blend in with the background. In the actual fight, Pac-Man's abilities get some cool uses, using the rev roll to charge panels in the area to expose Anubis' heart while dodging a bunch of attacks flying around. Even in its fixed state in the remake, it's a little bit of a clusterfuck and not the best boss, but it's a fine enough attempt that actually utilizes the game being a platformer, and I mean the second person perspective thing is definitely unique. The space area's main gimmick is time lasers. They go on and off, they add some timing challenges into the mix, and while they're not hugely exciting, they do add some pressure and tension and kind of ramp the game up. It also features some falling meteor obstacles, time platforms that disappear a bit after the button is pressed, lots of high pressure situations, which makes the whole world kind of stand out and be fun for being kind of this amping up. King Galaxian's a fun gimmick boss. If the name didn't give it away, it's a scrolling shooter boss that calls back to Namco's classics, Galaga and Galaxian. It controls well, it's a bit off the wall, it plays with Namco's arcade roots, which they love to do, especially with Pac-Man. It does abandon the core gameplay, but it's cute enough to let it slide. The circus area plays it pretty simple. Moving platforms are a fixture, and it has a few other things like clowns that spit poison gas towards the foreground. But the world really likes to toss out new ideas, perhaps my favorite being the spinning platforms that don't necessarily travel in the same direction as each other to navigate around. Although that last one where you need to rev launch onto it is pretty janky and cruel, sometimes you just hit it and fall off anyway. It's probably the strongest world for its ability to keep generating new ideas overall. Speaking of another gimmick boss, a kart racer, and a first person one at that. You'd expect this to be an unsalvageable mess given how far it goes outside of the game's typical comfort zone, but the controls are extremely tight and responsive, and it's pretty generous in the player's favor. I wouldn't quite say I like it, but I'm happy that I don't hate it. The factory area has some pretty unique stuff of its own too, lots of narrow pipes, uses platforms, and jutting steam, but also weirdly enough goes back to the water thing with a lot of really complicated underwater mazes through claustrophobic pipes, which are a nice mix up to the relatively stressful platforming that comes about in this world. The boss is kinda meh, he throws boxes and sometimes they have a metal pellet that can be used to hit him. If you're good you can get 2 hits per cycle, which is pretty satisfying, but it's a lot of waiting around outside of that. The final world, the mansion area, is a haunted graveyard, you know, cause they're ghosts. It's home to actually hard platforming, levels are long, difficult, and the primary gimmicks here are all around disappearing platforms. Coffins that slowly fade out of existence when stepped on, and clouds that do the same, but also drop periodic thunderbolts beneath them. The game still isn't crazy difficult, but it tries its best to keep you constantly on guard with some new tricks. I quite love the area for that. The final boss, Talkman's gimmick, is that he's Pac-Man, turning all of Pac-Man's tricks against him in the later phases. Starting simple, just charging at or shooting bullets towards Pac-Man, who needs to respond by pelting him with power pellets, but in phase 2 turning himself to metal, which can only be hurt by metal Pac-Man, by collecting metal pellets that sometimes drop when he's firing a barrage of cannonballs. I love this phase because it's possible to get up to 3 hits on him while you're metal if you're good. You could probably do 4, I've gotten close, but I mean, you can get through it pretty fast if you're trying. And finally, he hits a power pellet to get big, with Pac-Man needing to stomp on his feet to tip him over. The final boss is really good. It's got a lot of variety and utilizes a bunch of Pac-Man's more underutilized moves. Plus, unlike most platformer bosses, it has mechanics. It even brings in the power-ups. It's kind of cheap that the Pac family tosses out full health refills when you get low, one for each one that you save, which is a lot. But I guess it's also cool that there's actually some kind of tangible reward for exploring and making the boss easier, but The boss isn't like all that difficult, it's definitely doable without them, despite being 3 phases, because it doesn't overstay its welcome at all. I like ending on such a thorough clone antagonist. Talkman's design is barely less silly than Pac-Man's himself, and it's cute that they tied Pac-Man's power-ups into the whole thing. The game has 2 endings, the bad ending, which was the only ending in the original, and a new good ending, unlocked by saving the entire Pac family and Puka. The bad ending is way more interesting. Orson the ghost piloting Talkman bemoans that the ghosts live in solitude, unloved and unnoticed. Pac-Man doesn't miss a beat, shit-eating grin on his face, and he kills the ghost in cold blood. It's very bizarre to see, so blunt and awkward that it's kinda hilarious. In the good ending, Pac-Man forgives the ghost and invites them to his birthday party. The line "sorry for kidnapping your family" and stuff is hilarious in any context, and I guess that means Puka is like Pac-Man's stepson or something. His lover? I can't tell if this ending is more or less fitting for a game this goofy, but it's definitely not nearly as entertaining. It's nicer to the ghosts, but Pac-Man World Re-Pac is a cute little game. It feels very much like a PS1 game, in a way that the Crash and Spyro remakes kinda didn't. It's a budget title, you can blow through it in a few hours, it's got like 5 cutscenes at most, and it's a pretty simple game. However, Pac-Man is a character that, for as strange as his transition to 3D is, controls really well and has a fun moveset. It's not a mind-blowing game, it's not some 10 out of 10 game of the year contender, it's a middleware remake of a middleware game, but it's a very enjoyable time, especially if you want something nice and simple. It has fun level themes and music, enjoyable gameplay, gets a little bit tricky at the end, and Pac-Man's goofiness as a character is enjoyable. I liked my time with it enough, and I wouldn't mind seeing Namco do the same for Pac-Man World 2, especially if it also released as a little budget title down the line.